What's up, y'all? Welcome back to the channel. Thanks for stopping in with our Blazor WebAssembly tutorial. And this is part, I don't even know anymore. It's like 14 or something. So last time, if I remember correctly, we were talking about SQL stored procedures, and I was showing you a little bit about SQL Management Studio and how we built a SQL stored procedure that its whole purpose was to get all of the rooms from our database. But instead of calling it through Entity Framework, we instead are using this stored procedure to do it so the database does all the work. And essentially, this is just going to make it a lot faster. And to be honest, if you're looking at legacy software, most legacy software is going to be using stored procedures instead of Entity Framework anyways. So you might be looking at an application that doesn't use Entity Framework, or an application that does use Entity Framework, but you need to call stored procedures instead of using the Entity Framework the way it was meant to be purposed out. So how can we do that? Well, that's what we covered last time. And so now this time around, what I want to do is make this a little bit more robust. The idea is that currently as it is, we've got our rooms controller, and a rooms controller calls the rooms repository, and the rooms repository has this written in string. And we don't want this written in string here in the repository because this kind of locks us down to one particular thing that this method can do. And I want to make something a little bit more dynamic if we can. So what I want to employ this time around is something called a extension method. And the extension method essentially extends a class to have extra methods. And you can use an extension method for pretty much any class that exists. It doesn't even have to be one that you write. But in this case, it will be one that we wrote. It'll be the DBContext class right over here. So I want to add an extension method to this. And what we're going to do is start by right-clicking over here, and I'm going to say add, and we're going to say class, just like that. And we're just going to name this something appropriate, which will be home furnishings. Whoops, that's an N. Oh my goodness. Furnishings DBContext, and then we'll say extensions. And we put extensions on there so just so we know that it's an extension class when we're looking at it, but that doesn't really make it an extension class just yet. All right, so here's how we do it. So the first thing I want to do is I want to say public static. And it has to be a static method. That's the key. And actually up here too, the class itself has to be static so that when the compiler compiles it all together, it knows that this is an extension method. So I've got a public static, and then it's going to be running asynchronous. So it's going to be an async, and it's going to return a task, and it's going to return a list from that task. And then we're going to put a generic of T in here. So make sure it writes out T instead of task again, like it did for me. And we're just going to call this SQL query async with parameters. And I'll talk about parameters in just a second. And then here at the end of that, we'll put another generic T right there. And I'm going to explain all this in just a second. And we're going to say this home furnishings DBContext and context, and then string SQL, and then we're going to pass in an object of an empty array, but it can be nullable, so we'll put a question mark there. And then this will be called parameters, and then we're going to call it, or we're going to set it equal to null. And then the last thing we're going to do is exactly what it shows right there on my screen, which is we're going to type in where T, and then colon is class, and then curly braces to set it all into a method. Okay, so what did we just do here? So this static thing, of course, like I said, tells the compiler that this is going to be part of this home furnishings DBContext extensions, and it will be there for sure. Oops, and I misspelled extension, so I'll have to fix that in a second. The async, of course, is because it's going to return an async task. It's going to be running asynchronously with the database, so we don't have to wait for it to return anything before we do anything else. It will be a task, and it will be a list, and then we put this T in here because we've got a lot of different types of entities that we're working with, and we want T to represent a generic entity. And so what that means is that I can pass in any type of entity to this method, and the method will consume it regardless of what that entity is. And that's going to make it a lot easier for us to reuse this. So instead of having to make one of these methods for rooms and another for furniture, and if we add something like houses or whatever else we want to add to the application, we won't have to add a new method for each one of those. This one particular method will allow us to consume those entities over and over and over again, regardless of what we're passing to it. And then here, we want to make sure that it knows that for sure it is going to be bringing in this generic T. And then this section right here that I'm highlighting, this home furnishings DBContext context, this is what makes it an extension method. So anytime you want to make an extension method for any type of class that exists, the method that you create has to have this and then the class itself that you're extending. And that's what we're extending right here. This could be any class that we want. In this case, we're trying to extend the home furnishings DBContext though, and that's why we put this home furnishings DBContext, and then this is the object that it will populate. So it kind of works like dependency injection. Is very similar to that. It's essentially injecting this into our method so that we can continue to use it, or it's injecting this method into our home furnishings DBContext class. And then over here, we're going to get into a little bit more detail into these next things, but this string SQL is going to be the SQL that we pass to it. So this will be what runs. The object empty array that will be nullable, and we're going to set it to null, is going to be an optional parameter so that we can use this even without parameters. And I'll talk about parameters in just a second. And then of course, where t equals a class, that's the last thing we want to add on here so that this method knows that the t, the generic t over here, is going to be for sure one of the classes that we have somewhere in our program. So in this case, it'll be either the model furniture or the model rooms or any other classes that we end up adding in here later on. All right, so let's finish out fleshing this together. So we're going to say if the parameters is null. So that's the first thing we're going to check for. We want to make sure that the parameters is null first, or we're going to check to see that it is. Then we're just going to set it to a new object. And I don't want an index in there. We're just going to put it as an empty array object and finish up with curly braces. Okay. If, and this is the next part, we're going to say type of t, and we're going to say get properties and any. There we go. And so what we're doing here is we're checking to see that t has some properties. And if it does, we're going to run this code. Here's the thing. We can actually call this method even without a generic t or a class in here. We'd like to. That would be ideal, but it's not necessary. And so if we end up not doing that, it'll run this last little block of code down here at the end. But more often than not, this is where it's going to end up because t is going to be passed in. It will have some properties. And so it's going to run this last little bit, which will be to return the await context, which is the DB context, and we're going to say set t, close that off. Oops, I don't need those. And then from SQL raw. And then we're going to pass in the SQL query that we want to do, which in this case will most likely be the stored procedure. Any parameters that we've got, if it's none, that's okay. And then we're going to add this in here as no tracking. And the as no tracking is actually pretty important here because what ends up happening is because of the way Entity Framework tends to cache information and data into the browser, if you don't add the as no tracking, what it'll do is it'll populate your list with repeats. And I'll talk more about that a little bit later on as well when we see our results. And then finally, if for whatever reason none of those other things apply, then we're just going to do a generic database call where we execute the SQL raw async. There we go. And we're going to pass in that SQL, and we're going to pass in those parameters, and then we're going to return a default. And what this will do is this will be our kind of our catch-all that will just return any other extra stuff that ends up being passed to this method that doesn't include a generic t or doesn't include a class, or maybe it doesn't have other stuff like parameters or whatever. This is just our generic catch-all at the end of the method, just so we have something to do with the data and we don't just error out in the event that something that's not supposed to be passed gets passed. I'm going to do a quick rename here because I misspelled extensions, so that's pretty common for me. I don't really know how to spell, I guess. And then I don't know what's going on. Oh, parameters is probably it. Parameters is also spelled wrong, so I'm just going to go ahead and fix that too. Parameters. Nope, that's wrong too. Just struggling today. No big deal. Just ignore me. Parameters. Is that it? There we go. All right, spelling is not my strong suit. That's why I went into software development. All right, anyways. So now I've got this class all put together. I'm going to add some changes to my room repository, because remember our contract has to change in order for the repository to change. So I'm going to add in a new method here. It's going to be a task. It's going to set back an IEnumerable. There we go, IEnumerable. And what do I want it to be? Oh, I want it to be of type room. And we're just going to call this one get all rooms from extension. And this is only for testing purposes. I would name it something maybe a little bit better in the future. But for right now, I just want to test this and make sure that it actually is in fact working. So we're going to set it as an object, question mark, parameters, and we're going to set that equal to null. So as I said before, this parameters can be null if we want to. We don't have to pass in parameters, and that's okay if we don't, but I still want to have this parameter set to null then, so that the method has something to work with. If we don't pass it in, and we don't set it to null, then we're going to error out, because it's going to say, hey, you just gave me something, I don't know what to do with it, so fix yourself. So anyways, we're going to save that. And then over here in my room repository, as before, I need to implement those missing members. So I'm going to add that in there. And then now I'm just going to flesh this out. So I've already got my signature here. I just need to fix this down here, where I've got, again, just like the other ones, var rooms, it's going to be await, because it's going to be an async method. So let me add that in here, async, there we go. And I'm going to await. And this time I'm going to call the DBContext. But now, because I have that extension method, I should see that extension method that we had in here, the SQL query async with parameters, added in there. And so, let me go back here, dot SQL, there it is, right there at the top, SQL queries async with parameters. And the class that I want to pass in here is going to be of class room. So it's going to turn the generic T into an actual class of room. And then I'm just going to pass in whatever parameters I'm given from the controller. And then just like before, I'm going to return rooms. All right, so there we go. So this is all set up, ready to go. It's ready to return an IEnumerable of rooms, and it's calling this SQL query async with parameters. Notice I don't have any hard-coded string now in this method. This is just a generic method that I can call as is, okay? And then we're going to illustrate that here in our controller when we come over here and we call that particular method. So I'm going to make another controller endpoint here, HTTP get, and we're just going to name this one with a template of, let's see, get rooms sp, and we're going to call it extension, just so we can test it. And again, this is not how I would normally want to do things, but the idea here is just for testing purposes. So I'm going to say test, or sorry, I'm going to say task, and this is going to be an action result. And what do I want to return? Oh, I want to return an IEnumerable again. And this one is going to be of type room. Make sure I get that extra little arrow bracket in there. I'm going to call this get rooms from extension and spell it right. There we go. All right. So now what's this one going to look like? Just like the other ones, actually. There's no real difference here. It's going to be var rooms equals await, and we're going to call the room repository. There we go. And from that room repository, this is one's going to be get all rooms from extension instead. And I'm going to pass in just sp get all rooms, just like that. So here, instead of in the repository hard-coding this the string name for the stored procedure, I'm instead going to put it here in the controller. And it gives me a little bit more control over how I consume that repository, because that's kind of the key factor here, is I want to make sure that my repository doesn't get changed all that much. The controller gets changed instead. And then I'm just going to return the room. So what I've done here now is I've moved essentially this hard coding of this stored procedure get all rooms out to the controller instead. And as you can see, what I'm doing is I'm calling the get all rooms from extension, but I'm only passing in one thing, and that's the SQL here. And so when the rooms repository method gets it, it's going to put that as the SQL string, but my object, since it's not getting past anything, it'll just set it as null. And then it's going to pass both the SQL string that I'm sending it and this null parameter to my extension method. And then from here, the string SQL, and the null parameter will be sent through these methods here, these switches, and to see where it belongs. Most likely it's going to land right over here, and it's going to call the SQL, the database with the SQL stored procedure, no parameters sent in, and it's going to send me back a list, and all should be right with the world. So let's test that out real quick and make sure that it works. And that's what the Swagger UI, of course, is for. And so let's go back here to, all right, now we've got a new method up here from our controller. We're going to try it out. We should be getting back, again, a list of rooms here. And let's just go ahead and execute and see what it does. And boom, just like that. So essentially, I'm getting the exact same thing back that I'm getting from here, this first method that we made. The difference, of course, is that this first method is hard coding the SQL stored procedure string in the repository, whereas the second method is not hard coding it there, it's hard coding it in the controller. And hard coding it in the controller is a much better practice simply because it gives you as a developer more control over what is being sent to the repository. You want to try to minimize how much the repository is changed, if at all possible. It's really meant for just simple procedures like getting things, like getting everything, or getting one, or changing one, or updating one, or deleting one, but not so much for a whole bunch of different methods. If your repository class is getting filled up with lots of random stuff, you're going to want to rethink how you're accessing your database and instead move as much of that to the controller as you can. So it's just my piece of advice. So with that, we're going to leave it off there. And next time, I'm going to show you how to utilize this for what it is, because as I did say, it's supposed to be more dynamic. It's supposed to take in parameters and a bunch of other stuff. And so I want to look and explore that a little bit more in detail and see how we can use that to our advantage and reuse this, and also reuse this method here for a variety of different controller calls. And so we're going to look at that next time. So see you in the next video, and goodbye.